Now, what do you think the opposite of life is? If life is here, let's say we're on a kind of continuum, what would be the diametrically opposite thing to life? Death?
Yes.
So you might put death up here. That would kind of, yeah, that would I think be a fairly rational thing to suggest. Any other suggestions? Disability. That's interesting. Yeah. Why do you say that?
Quadriplegic could consider the same result. They could consider that a death is a disability is the end.
So it could,
and
for some people,
where they are contextually
yeah.
in the, is it depressive, but they
yeah.
could turn around and say the same thing to you, but it's the same as death.
Right, so in that sense, if someone becomes differently abled because of something that happens to them, they could experience the shift in their understanding of themselves and what life could hold for them as a kind of death.
Autonomy, isn't it?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be different. So interesting. Yeah.
The inanimate.
The inanimate. What do you mean by the inanimate?
The building blocks that are not actually living.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a really interesting suggestion. I can feel a whole conversation coming up out of that one. Okay. Paul Valent says, yep, I can understand why these things would be opposite to life. He actually says trauma. Now, I'm not saying that these things are wrong. I'm just telling you what he says. Now, the reason he says that is because he sees what he calls a dialectic. A dialectic is a kind of conversational relationship, something that goes to and fro. A dialectic is very, very simplistically put. A dialectic is someone puts forward a hypothesis. We together try and prove that the hypothesis is right. We discover that it's partly right, partly wrong, and on that basis we find out what the next question is, and we keep going. But his understanding of dialectic between life and trauma is slightly different. He's talking about an ongoing balance, in a sense, a challenge and a response, a challenge and a response. Trauma is kind of like the challenge. And it comes, as we've already experienced ourselves this morning, externally and internally. So we have internal environmental changes and we have external environmental changes. And those present challenges to life. Life is a process. And life constantly adjusts itself in response to trauma, challenge. That's why we would describe ourselves as dynamic. This is all under the banner of the physiology of trauma. You know, this is lecture number 1. Sorry, I forgot to say that. It's on in your book. So he calls this a dialectic. What do you think of that?
I think that well captures it because trauma, you have to readjust to get back into normal life. So it is like a part of your previous life dies that you can no longer have because of something that happened.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
It means there's hope.
Say more.
Well, if it's not a fait accompli, if there's an adjustment that's possible,
Yep.
then And trauma doesn't have to be the death that it could be.
Right.
The possibility.
Right. So by the very nature of our organism as dynamic and changeable, we have hope where there's trauma, because in order to stay alive, we adjust, and it's part of it. Happens as we experienced this morning without even thinking about it. Our body immediately responds to the environmental impacts, to what happens to us. We are, as Van der Kolk says right from the start, resilient creatures. As a race, as a species, we have survived all kinds of traumas, collectively and individually, and we keep living, we keep adjusting, we keep evolving in order to stay alive. Yeah.
It's the troops, isn't it? It's the trauma at all levels. Physiologically, the process of eating has a trauma component in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the body organism interacts with that food in a to manage it and have that dialogue with it and decide if it's benign or it's not, and what do I do if it isn't, and what do I do if it is, and
That's right.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's the mini trauma.
I mean, Van der Kolk would say,
And
well, trauma is that which has such a big impact on you that it's intolerable.
yes,
You can't, it threatens your very existence in that sense.
but where is that on the continuum?
Right,
You
but we
know?
can feel how our engagement with our environment at all kinds of different levels is a related experience to what we would call trauma.
Being cold is
Right,
it's whatever is
yeah,
needs to be adjusted for.
exactly. And we'll get into that a little bit in a moment,
Yeah.
the whole idea of homeostatic regulation, which is where Antonio Damasio comes in. Paul Valant says this: within the life-trauma dialectic, the purpose of life then may be said to be to survive and fulfil oneself according to the life cycle and to help others do the same. That's life. We can't survive without each other, so part of life is not only the regulation of our own organism, but the ability to be in harmonious, life-giving social relationships. It's part of what it means to stay alive. Trauma is a threat to purposeful survival and fulfilment according to the life cycle of self and others. What do you think? It's taking it right down to the sort of basic physiological building blocks of what it means to be alive, isn't it? Note that he's got in there purposeful survival. So he's recognising that to live is not just to be alive in that sense. To live fully is to live with meaning and purpose. Yeah.
And it walks with gentle decay, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Gentle decay
Yeah.
isn't trauma, it's the
Yeah.
nature of all life.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice.
In fact, one could suggest, and this is something that I sort of toy with a lot, that I love the way you call it gentle decay, that gentle journey towards death that we all undergo is in fact crucial for the ongoing life of our species
And the life cycle.
and the life cycle. So without it, we would become static in that sense, and as a species we would die.
And so it could be trauma if it threatens the end of life,
Yeah.
as well as like
Yeah.
if it keeps you alive beyond that natural life cycle of general decay.
Yeah.
And that the trauma, the medical trauma, being kept alive beyond life.
Yeah, it can be. Absolutely.
Mm.
We all know that in our own bodies, when cancerous cells become present and they refuse to die, they overcome the life of the organism, and then all of the cells die. And we could say, well, that's maybe a natural part of the life cycle to enable that to, to take place, and it's actually potentially meaningful, as horrendous as it can be. They're all questions we can ask.
And being kept alive can be the trauma, not the dying.
Yeah, that's right. And, the whole idea of environmental trauma comes in there, where we, as a species, we are becoming more and more populous, and our technology is having more and more of an impact on our environment and reducing the capacity of our environment to sustain life. So you can hear the permeations of participating in a healthy life cycle.
I think the question of hope is the most important thing. The hope can help a person, fluctuate between life and trauma. So if one does not have hope in life, then to die.
Yeah.
Someone.
And even where conscious hope that we can reflect on and think about and write about and so on, is not present, Bessel van der Kolk would suggest that your increased awareness of your physiological self can bring that hope to consciousness by virtue of the fact that it can change the brain, can change the way the brain functions, and we'll talk more about that.
The body is an optimist.
The body is the eternal optimist. It will keep adjusting and changing in order to keep us on track.
Excuse me, in this context, how do you explain the person who went to Switzerland to die from Australia?
Sorry, say that again, Brad.
The person, he went to Switzerland.
Yes.
To die there from Australia.
The
104 years.
104-year-old.
Yes, 104-year-old.
How do I explain it?
Yeah. So, do you think he's having trauma to live?
What do you think?
I think it was a trauma for him to continue to live. So he lost hope. It's better to die.
The question is, did he lose hope? Did he lose hope, or did he actually place his...
Express his
did he
hope.
start to receive meaning from a different future story?
It's quite a rational decision.
It was, wasn't it? It was an extraordinary story.
I think he lost patience.
Yeah, maybe.
Can I just
Yes, you can.
throw something out there?
Go for it.
I suppose one of the things that, and I don't know if this is just because I've got a medical sort of paradigm, just from my own background and training. Are we saying, because as I read this Van der Kolk's book, there's an awful lot that would tend to suggest that all disease is caused as a result of something that's gone on in terms of emotional, psychological trauma of some description or physical. Where does just the natural disease process or process of degeneration fit in to this whole scene?
Yep. Perfect question, segueing us to the next slide. Will we go there now? Let me just maybe do I'll attempt an answer to your question.
Before that one, could I just also say,
Yeah.
The whole ability to adjust,
Yeah.
the organism to adjust and to even understand the nature of hope,
Yeah.
sort of presupposes that the person understands the fact that their life is being directed as a result of their trauma. So there has to be a consciousness that the trauma is directing the way their life is actually unfolding. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So without that consciousness, without that understanding that things are not unfolding well, my life's gone the way I wouldn't have hoped, da da da. But the fact that they haven't connected that with some past trauma then negates the ability of the organism to make the necessary adjustments. Is that?
Well, I think what we could suggest that the organism is making adjustments all the time, and not always particularly helpful ones.
Okay.
Okay. So, which is why we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, because as organisms we then engage in instinctive self-healing processes, and they adjust the way we socialise and respond with us. So all kinds of behaviours that as a society we detect are unhelpful, unhealthy, reducing the capacity of that person to live a fulfilled life, are then potentially traced to an unconscious memory of trauma. But it's not always, healing from a Van der Kolk perspective would come when that person is enabled to recognise the symptoms, as it were, as related to their trauma. The problem is getting close to the trauma without being re-traumatised. And that's what we'll talk a bit about that today. But in terms of the natural process and so on, I think if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about whether or not it's possible to reduce the natural process of living and dying to emotion and feeling and so on. Was that your question?
Yeah,
is that kind of where you were going with it?
Really,
yeah. And Damasio, and we'll read a quote from him now, is really, really interesting on that point, because he asks, well, what are the physiological foundations of emotion and feeling? We tend to think of those as elements of the psyche, and in that sense, mind over body or whatever. Damasio helps us to reframe emotion and feeling as the most emotion as the most pre-conscious response to the natural processes of life that have an impact on us. So emotion's the first signal in our physiology that says something's changed. It's gotten cold. Start shivering, So emotions are pre-conscious in that sense. Let's have a read of what he says here. The biological function of emotions is twofold. The first function is the production of a specific reaction to the inducing situation. So whatever the situation is, the natural process or as the case may be, the abuse or whatever it is that threatens the situation. In an animal, for instance, the reaction may be to run or to become immobile or to beat the hell out of the enemy or to engage in pleasurable behaviour. In humans, the reactions are essentially the same, tempered, one hopes, by higher reason and wisdom. Now let's just pause there, because that's the first signal that we get from Damasio that can teach us a bit about what happens in our brains when we suffer post-traumatic stress disorder, and that is the communication between the reaction and the higher capacity to reason and reflect is disrupted in trauma. Okay? The second biological function of emotion is the regulation of the internal state of the organism such that it can be prepared for a specific reaction. For example, providing increased blood flow to arteries in the legs so that muscles receive extra oxygen and glucose in the case of a flight reaction, or changing heart and breathing rhythms in the case of freezing on the spot. In either case and in other situations, the plan is exquisite and the execution is most reliable. In short, for certain classes of clearly dangerous or clearly valuable stimuli in the internal or external environment, evolution has assembled a matching answer in the form of emotion. And I put his little table up there that sort of shows his kind of metaphorical understanding of how our physiology interacts. And the most basic responses include metabolic regulation, reflex, the biological machinery behind what become pain and pleasure, drives and motivations, all pre-conscious. This is why philosophers are starting to talk about the whole organism as a mind. Because this stuff is going on in us all of the time without thinking about it. Emotions, complex stereotyped patterns of response, which includes secondary emotions, primary emotions and background emotions. And that's all, as you can see, the two-way arrows. This stuff is bouncing off each other the whole time. Feelings, sensory patterns signalling pain, pleasure and emotions become images. Okay? We start to actually reflect consciously on what's happening in our organism. I feel hot. I feel frightened. Those feelings are conscious, cognitive, metaphorical articulations of what's happening here. This is the way Damasio describes it. Consciousness emerges with feeling, self-consciousness. And then we don't really know what consciousness is, but Damasio's starting, and other neuroscientists are starting to suggest it's the capacity of the brain to map what's going on in the whole organism and present an image to itself of how it is in relation to its environment. That's what consciousness, the core of consciousness, is said to be. High reason, complex, flexible and customised plans of response are formulated in conscious images and may be executed as behaviour. And I think Van der Kolk would add there the capacity of the prefrontal cortex to regulate this stuff. This stuff is amygdala stuff. Happens. Have you read this stuff? Yeah. The stuff that happens here, it's the kind of fight, flight, fright, respond with that. It's the instinctual response. And thank goodness for it, because where would we be without that infinitesimal, they try and measure how long it takes the vascular system to send a message to the amygdala, and it's such a micro amount of time that it's extraordinary. Van der Kolk suggests that where people are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, there has been a disruption to the neural pathways that communicate from here to here, and back here. So, for example, when I step out onto a road, even before I'm consciously aware of it, my organism is aware that there's a very large vehicle hurtling towards me over there, and my instinctive response is to flight, hopefully run away, step back. If I'm functioning well, my amygdala immediately sends that physiological basic response to my prefrontal cortex, and I have a remarkable capacity to reflect and reason in response to what's going on here. I can actually judge, when I look at the vehicle, how fast it's going and whether I'm safe to proceed or whether in fact my amygdala is right and I should step back. And it all happens just like that. When I can't communicate between these two places, even if I were to step out here, look up and realise that the vehicle was turning right and going away, my amygdala would still win the day, and I would be responding physiologically to the potential trauma that's no longer actually there. Post-traumatic stress disorder holds me in that place without this. So I'm responding inappropriately, in a sense, to the reality of the situation. So I got interested in trauma through working with asylum seekers in Melbourne, and one of my earliest experiences of a person suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder was a young man who hadn't been seen for a few days, so we enacted our safety plan and we went and knocked on his door and no response, and got the key out and said, we're coming in, we just want to check you're okay. Come in, and there he is, curled up in the fetal position in the corner in a dark room. In his mind, he was in the midst of his trauma memory. He may as well have been back in the midst of the original trauma that led him to escape his country of origin. There was nothing in his reflective capacity to tell his body, calm down, it's okay, you are safe. And when the ambulance came to collect him, he had another response to the fact that the ambulance officer, the ambulance person, was wearing a two-way radio here. And that triggered another traumatic response. Now, if that person had a fully functional neural pathway between his amygdala and his prefrontal cortex, he'd be able to tell the difference between a two-way radio on an ambulance officer and a two-way radio on a military police officer who was going to do it, but he couldn't tell. Couldn't tell the difference. Can you kind of get a sense of why this stuff is becoming so important in our understanding of trauma? Fantastic. Van der Kolk, what's the time? Let's just go with Van der Kolk's definition of trauma. I love Van der Kolk because he tells a story. He tells his own story, really, in reaching an understanding of what trauma really is. Trauma happens to us, our friends, our families and our neighbours. As human beings, we belong to an extremely resilient species. Since time immemorial, we have rebounded from relentless wars, countless disasters, both natural and man-made, human-made, and violence and betrayal of our own lives. But traumatic experiences do leave traces, whether on a large scale on our histories and cultures, or close to home, on our families with dark secrets being imperceptibly passed down through generations. They also leave traces on our minds and emotions, on our capacity for joy and intimacy, and even on our biology and immune systems. Trauma, by definition, is unbearable and intolerable, and so we try and adjust in response to it. We try and survive. It's our story, in a sense. It is our story. Now, just before we go and have a cuppa, I want to make sure we understand this idea of homeostatic regulation. Would anyone like to give us a definition?
That's where the body responds to go back to an equilibrium, where everything remains the same.
Right.
And so it responds to a change. It's like cold temperature by shivering to keep
Yep,
warm.
it's everything we've been talking about, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. So let's just say an organism, in order to stay alive, needs to have internal and external conditions that fit within these two lines here. Yeah. If something happens to move the external environment, and then therefore necessarily the internal environment, outside of these parameters, the organism will die, because the conditions for life to be are no longer present. So we have evolved to be extraordinary things, really, because we have these pre-conscious, as we were talking before, pre-conscious processes that interact with one another that change in order to stay the same. And staying the same means staying alive. So that's why we use the language of stasis, which seems counterintuitive, because stasis means death, doesn't it? Sameness, anything that just stays the same all the time, isn't it dead? But you can get the ironic truth in that sense, that in order to stay alive, we have this narrow set of circumstances, physiological realities. But in order to stay in here, we need to be constantly changing. Constantly changing. Now, the young man that I was telling you about in the fetal position, what do you think his capacity would be to maintain a loving relationship from which he could have children? reduced,
Diminished.
considerably. Yeah. So you can see how trauma diminishes our capacity to stay in here. Because part of staying in here is being able to maintain good relationships and continue as a species in that sense. Yeah. Damasio talks a lot about homeostatic regulation as the sort of foundational idea underlying what it means to stay alive. And it's connected to so much, you know, like it's not only, people say, oh yeah, but if we just put it all down to homeostatic regulation, it means that we've got no free will. We're just completely determined by our environment. And we like, particularly Christians, Christians like to think about free will a lot. You know, I actually have the capacity to determine my own life. You know, other religious faiths have a greater sense of reliance, gentle reliance on the rhythms of life. I would say with Paul Tillich that we have finite freedom, limited freedom, because we know that if it gets really cold and shivering isn't enough, we can manipulate our environment, can't we? We can build a house. And so we have the freedom to actually impose ourselves on the environment and change it so that we can stay in here. So it's not all about just being at the mercy of the elements. We do have, to a limited extent, free will.
And it's like standing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have, if your goal is to stand, you have a number of different ways of achieving that.
That's right.
And to be in, even if you're just standing still, your body is in constant adapting to stay upright.
Exactly. Yeah. Imperceptible movements to interact with our inner ear and our brain as we.
So your choices come with how you do that.
Yeah.
You know, you put your hand on a wall.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If your instinctual response is not functioning well, you can actually interact. Your brain can interact and change the environment. Speaking from a theological, spiritual perspective, the theologian and medical practitioner Albert Schweitzer called this process and out of that he articulated what he called the first spiritual act, reverence for life. And he said this I will to live is pre-conscious. It's embedded in every cell. You know, it's something that is, and we can see that as we analyse the makeup of the human organism. But he's using a spiritual metaphor. And you can see, actually, he built a whole system of ethics out of that statement. Because if I will to live, but I'm also aware of others' will to live, and he included the whole environment, the whole organic environment, animals, plants, you know, the whole system, then I will have an instinctive awareness that in order to live, which is what I will sustain life collectively. Interesting guy. Not often you hear of a theologian who goes and gets trained as a medical practitioner and moves to Africa. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952 or 6, can't remember. Why don't we stop and have a cuppa, go to the loo, whatever you, walk out in the sun, respond to your physiological needs, and be aware of that as you do it. Have a rest for 10 minutes, come back. What's the actual time? Because that's wrong. 2, 3, oh, it's pretty close.
20 to 3.
So come back about 5 to 3, and we'll continue our conversation.